Okay. Hello and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us from wherever you're located across the globe today. We're really glad to have you join us for a discussion on cultural intelligence and why it is the key to the future of work. Before we get started, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. We are on a webinar, so everyone is muted and our cameras are off outside of the panelists today. Please, as many of you are already beginning to do, feel free to use the chat feature throughout the webinar if you have any questions for the panelists or if you want to offer your own thoughts or comments on the topics we discussed today. Just a quick note, we will save 10 to 15 minutes at the end of today's session for Q&A with our audience and our panelists. I want to take a moment to introduce Ms. Prudence Anglam, who will be handling our session administration today. If you have any questions or any technical concerns, please feel free to contact Prudence directly using the chat feature. We're going to cover some really interesting topics today, including how something called cultural intelligence, or CQ, can help you develop critical workplace skills, how it can help you enhance your relationships and boost your own professional growth. We are also going to cover why cultural intelligence is critical for our diverse and rapidly changing global world, and how we can learn to navigate and prepare for the future of work, including AI, machine learning, polarization, and more. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists, but first with a special note about our dear friend, Ina. You'll notice that Ms. Tuka is unfortunately not on our call today. She had a last-minute unexpected emergency and will not be able to participate, but we send her our best wishes and we look forward to partnering with her on another pertinent topic in the future. We are glad, however, to be able to talk with our other two panelists today, Dr. David Livermore and Dr. Andrew Malinsky, both respected global authors and thought leaders. Andrew's a professor at Brandeis University's International Business School. He's a consultant, a keynote speaker, and author of books Global Dexterity and Reach. And we look forward to hearing from you, Andrew, today and your experiences and expertise. David is a social scientist, an author, and a speaker with deep expertise in cultural intelligence and global leadership. He's authored several books, including Digital, Diverse, and Divided, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, Expand Your Borders, and more. I'm excited. I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to ask Dave to answer the first question for us. Can you talk to us, Dave, a little bit about what is cultural intelligence? We'd like to hear it defined by you and also learn how does it relate to some of these skills we're talking about, like effective communication, critical thinking, agility, leadership, and so forth. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Keela, and thanks, Andy, for the privilege of joining him on this discussion. And like Keela, really grateful to see so many people from a variety of places around the world, a lot of familiar names and as well as unfamiliar. Yeah, so as I'm sure many of our guests are aware, cultural intelligence at the most basic level is just the ability to work effectively in diverse contexts. If I can unpack that just a bit, the traditional approach to how you work in different cultures, whether it's in a diversity conversation or whether it's cross-cultural management, has been fairly focused on what we call a cultural comparison approach. So if you're a German and you're working in China, what do you need to understand about China? But what if you're a German managing director for a US company working in China? Suddenly now it's more blurred. And what if in China now you have people from a variety of races and ethnicities and nationalities and ages and sexual identities, et cetera? Suddenly the cultural boundaries become more blurred. So our interest 20 some years ago is, how do you actually develop a capability that, to your point, Keela, allows you this agility to move in and out of many different cultural norms and values when you aren't just working on one kind of fixed thing. So I think it directly links to the kinds of things we want to talk about today, the agility, the critical thinking that's needed. And of course, as you're very well aware from our work together at the Cultural Intelligence Center and many of others who are joining us, cultural intelligence is comprised of 4 different capabilities. CQ Drive. So if we come back to my example of the managing director who's German, working for a US company in China, to what degree do they have the motivation, the confidence, the perseverance that needed to deal with just the challenges of having to adjust all day long? The knowledge, that'd be some of the typical things that we talk about in cross-cultural work. What's their knowledge of, some of the cultural values of leadership differences or individualism or collectivism, but also what's their understanding of geopolitics and how is what's going on in Russia now suddenly going to impact what they're doing in China with a US company. Strategy piece, which I think is one of the most critical ones for today's conversation, your ability to translate your motivation and understanding into a strategy that actually will work for the diversity of individuals and situations involved. And then finally, action, a piece that I think we were really hoping Inu could help speak to us on of the well-being for ourselves of how do you do this constant adaptation to the polarization, the communication differences, AI, et cetera, in a way that's true to yourself, and something that I know Andy will have a whole lot to talk about. When do you flex? When do you not flex? When are you losing yourself in the midst of that? So, as you know, I could go on all day long, but that's kind of my quick take. And Gila, don't sell yourself short. You're an expert in cultural intelligence as well, so I'd welcome what you would add to my kind of intro there on how I would define CQ.
I think I will add to it, and then I think it'll be interesting to hear from Andy as well. Cultural intelligence as a framework, like Dave just described it, including its 4 components, our curiosity, our motivation, our knowledge, our strategy, our action, our ability to put it all into place and flex. What I think it can offer to individuals is a way of thinking and behaving differently using a really easy to understand mental model. Okay, it's been a hard day. How can I make sure I really think about my drive today and why I need to be motivated to work with this person or move this project forward? I can say in my own experience, as I've grown as a leader of people, it helps me to have a really foundational way of looking at typical problems and not getting stuck in how to solve or think about those problems. So I think it's very practical is what I'm trying to say. Let's talk about the ways that we work. They're changing, right? We've got a lot of new things in today's landscape that we are dealing with. We have a lot of the old challenges that have always been around about how do I work with my colleague who might not be like me, as an example. But I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges today that are facing leaders and other professionals as we think about things like evolving AI, machine learning, globalization, and the polarization that seems to be coming with that. Andy, I wonder if you could take part of this question and talk to us, in your experience, what are some of those biggest challenges that we're starting to hear and see in this field of work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to take part here. I'm really happy to be part of this, Keela and Dave, and it's too bad that Ina can't join us as well. So where should I start? What particular aspect? You talked about AI. You talked about some of the challenges people have in terms of the future of work. Should I just start speaking about those?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would be great to hear from your perspective. What do you think people are challenged with today in terms of how the future of work is changing?
I think one of the biggest challenges leaders face today, at least the leaders that speak with me, is how to manage the whole remote work, hybrid work situation, and in the context of creating a cohesive organizational culture. I think that is one of the biggest, and of course, the global culture and cultural differences and cultural intelligence plays a role there too. But like, how do you are you fully remote? Are you like Elon Musk at Tesla? Are you hybrid? Are you, does it, or are you, does it change? Does it differ by the particular role people have? Does it differ by tasks? Does it matter? I think that's a real big challenge that people have. And I think that COVID and the COVID crisis just accentuated that for organizations. And I don't think that leaders and organizations had or even have necessarily like a great idea about how to do it. And in the social sciences, I don't think we have any clear answers either. I mean, I think people are kind of going off the seat of their pants in terms of using their instinct on that. So I think that's a big challenge. I think AI, I don't know, is it a challenge? It's definitely the hot topic du jour. AI. I mean, I think that gosh, I think the question there right now for me is how to engage and use AI effectively. I think some people have very strong reactions to AI. There's a lot of fear about AI, concerns that the anthropomorphizing computers and thinking that they're starting to become real. And there's been some real crazy stories about AI conversations that AI has with individuals and what that can mean. So there's I think that's kind of that's a pretty hot topic. And I don't think I think that's been a topic for a long time. I suspect that, I wasn't around at the time, but when calculators first came out, I'm sure people were thinking, oh my gosh, there's, that's magic. That's crazy. Computers are thinking, when in fact they aren't thinking. They're just, programmed, or they're able to use their capacities to do tasks that we didn't think were possible. And it's sort of on a, it's that on steroids with current AI and chat GPT and so on. I mean, I think a lot of people are fearing that their jobs are in jeopardy. Entry level coders, for instance, their job's going to be in jeopardy because of advances in AI, or will their jobs change because of that? In where I sit, I'm a professor at a university, and there's a lot of fear in the academy about AI. And do we, as professors, do we matter? Can we give assignments and tests that will test students and require them to use creative thinking, or can they just sort of like pop it into AI and come up with an answer? And so and there's a lot of debate about that, and I have opinions about that too. But I think that's sort of like, if I put my finger on the pulse of what's happening, that's what I hear.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dave, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so many thoughts, Andy. I mean, in part, even the anthropomorphism, like sometimes I feel bad for just being a jerk back to chat GPT, like, no, that's wrong. And then I go, maybe I shouldn't be quite so, especially when it responds with, I'm sorry, I didn't get that quite right. The thing that strikes me, Keela, is, as you certainly know, the leading indicator of cultural intelligence, and specifically drive, is one's level of openness. And so much of what Andy was just talking about there struck me of, to what degree are we open or have the growth mindset, to use Dweck's term, about these new realities, which doesn't, I think, mean like, oh yeah, let's just turn everything into chat GPT. But even in the work around polarization and DEI, so much of the challenge is a fixed mindset that says, oh, now if I'm committed to inclusion, that means people who look like me no longer have a place at the table. And like, really? Like, why is creating space for another voice at the table suddenly mean that you don't? If I could say one other thing, that's more specifically around the DEI area, because obviously, especially since George Floyd, that too has been an issue that is right in the center of workplace discussion. And I said to you in a conversation the other day, Keela, I never could have imagined that a year ago, things today could be even more polarized surrounding DEI than they are. But now it's like people automatically make an assumption about you politically based upon, whether you're for or against DEI. But where I'm going with that, the same link to, how does cultural intelligence play a role? You would certainly know, but some of our attendees may not be aware that when we first started working with Starbucks, one of the things that endeared them to cultural intelligence is they needed a more global language and approach to their inclusion initiatives, because there was a lot of reaction toward their US offerings that, like, this is too US centric. And we understand that, anti-racism and that is an important topic for you, but that's irrelevant to us in the Middle East or Europe. And they were like, well, it's not irrelevant, but we understand it needs to be framed differently. So they found that cultural intelligence gave them a more macro approach to still get at these issues of inclusion. I know we have other things to get into. I just want to acknowledge too, I think, people in the chat who are talking about the bias related to AI too is absolutely an issue that is being highlighted. And I appreciated the comment there from Sarah of what are even some of the subtleties. Maybe it's not necessarily even bias, but the kind of stuff that Andy and I have been talking about for years, like just the nuance that's hard enough to do as fellow human beings, and then you do it with this program machine. So I'm with Andy, though. I think we're way ahead of ourselves in terms of what the research is actually telling us about it. And, our students and others will be the ones who actually talk back to us about, okay, here's what you actually had wrong about this.
Right. Rapidly evolving, right? I think I also have picked up on some of the comments, and actually I was talking internally to our director over our associate facilitator program, and she was sharing with me that we have a partner right now who's using cultural intelligence to train the AI how to be more culturally sensitive. I have no idea how one would even go about that, but I find it very interesting that that's already happening in the landscape. People are already asking the right questions, right? Okay, AI or machine learning could do a lot for us, but what do we need to be mindful of in that process? Because a lot of what we're talking about today and what we're going to continue talking about goes back to the title of this webinar, the human element. And that is really important piece that we need to tap into to say, well, what is it that makes us different from a machine, as an example? And I think Dave's comment about openness is a great one. It applies to what Andy was talking about with hybrid working, virtual working, in office working. The solution is not going to be to go back to what we used to do. It's got to be, how is the landscape changing? How open are we to trying something new? And we have to approach it that way. I'd like to move into another discussion topic. I think, practically speaking, and this is really what I think a lot of people want to hear about, what is it and how is it that the cultural intelligence framework can really empower us to navigate some of these challenges, to navigate the leadership challenges we're talking about? How do you make a decision about hybrid working, right? How do you make a decision about when to pull AI into your business practice, into your teaching, into what you're doing with your students? And how is it that this framework can sort of help us navigate some of those decisions so that we can make sure we're making decisions that are best for all, not necessarily relying on maybe what we would have done in the past? Dave, why don't you go ahead and start with that one?
Let me start first a bit at the high level that relates to some things that you and Andy said. I think I said openness is key, but to your point, it's not just openness. To Andy's point, it's like, well, you mentioned, Andy, without telling us what it is, but you have some of your own opinions about how it ought to be played into the academic classroom or not, chat GPT and that. So it's openness, but with a conscious strategy. You know, Andy, I don't want to steal your thunder, but a lot of your great work in global dexterity is, well, I shouldn't always adapt to whatever the norm is there. So openness doesn't automatically mean I'm a chameleon to follow whatever trend or whatever cultural practice is there. And so for me, that links back to where I was defining cultural intelligence at the front end, that let's take a practical example of how do you do brainstorming, for example. And, you know, to use the cultural comparison approach, it would be, okay, if I'm brainstorming in person with a group of people like me, I probably don't really even need to think a whole lot about it other than to say, we set the meeting for 4 o'clock, we're going to do a brainstorming session. And, you know, yeah, I mean, might need to pay attention to how the introverts will engage differently than the extroverts, but it's, you know, I can do that. I've done it for years. The more fixed, like cross-cultural comparison approach would be, if I'm going to travel to Singapore and I'm going to do brainstorming with predominantly Singaporeans, once again, okay, it's still fairly fixed, but I'll have to think about how am I going to actually get them to engage. But now let's imagine that it's a hybrid brainstorming session with people from myriad different backgrounds. You know, the drive piece, let's just be honest, it's going to be a whole lot more work. So I'm going to have to motivate myself and others to say, how are we going to effectively do that? There has to be some understanding of what are the different ways that people approach brainstorming, something that's uniquely an individualist kind of orientation to it. You know, my independent idea versus yours, no such thing as a dumb idea, you know, all those things we tell. The strategy, like, this is where I think openness by itself is not enough. There has to be a strategic plan. If people are genuinely going to engage, maybe the way cultural intelligence helps me is I do a little bit more planning up front and say, I'm expecting everyone to come to this brainstorming session with at least 2 ideas about X. You can work on them together with other people. You could send them to me ahead of time, but I will be asking on you, which might mean flexing your own behavior to feel comfortable doing that on a virtual call. And then, you know, the action piece, like there's probably a third culture that I'm trying to develop on my team and in that call, rather than just saying, you all need to adapt to my way or me to your way, et cetera. So that's just one example, I think, where it could practically bring together cultural differences in the traditional way we think about it, along with, you know, to your and Andy's point, the hybrid work environment. Because I'm with Andy, I think people have been thrust into, you know, we're shaming managers for not, you know, leading people well hybrid, but it's a whole new skill set that we don't really even know what it is they need to do effectively. And at least these ideas around global dexterity and cultural intelligence are a part of the core capability, I think, that allows people to do it better.
Yeah. You know, actually, Andy, if you could sort of respond to that and talk to us a little bit. I really like what Dave says. It is openness, it's curiosity, but just like learning about something, an awareness isn't enough unless you start actioning on it, unless you start intentionally building it into what you're doing. Can you talk to us a little bit about this idea of flexibility? Right. So we know we need to be open. We know we need to strategize, but I'd like you to sort of hone in on what Dave was talking about and your take on when to flex and when not to flex. How do we think about that and make those decisions, especially as leaders and colleagues to our peers?
Yeah, lots in there.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there that I had thoughts about. Sure, I can speak about flexibility, and then I just took a couple of notes. I'll respond to some of what Dave talked about. So my work essentially is about stepping outside your cultural comfort zone. That's essentially what it is. So it's about stepping outside your cultural comfort zone. You know, doing something that might be unfamiliar, maybe uncomfortable, maybe feels awkward, maybe you're embarrassed about your ability to do it, but it's something that aligns with your goals in that situation. And so that's what I mean by flexing. And so I find that people are able to learn to do it. I also find that there are what I call psychological roadblocks sometimes in trying to do it. People can feel inauthentic, people can feel incompetent. They can worry they're not good at what they need to do if they're trying to step outside their comfort zone. They can sometimes also worry that people aren't going to like this version of them if they're stepping outside their comfort zone. You know, it's not something that you're used to. It's not your go-to. And then finally, sometimes people can feel resentful. I mean, so logically, they might get it that in this situation, it makes sense for them to adapt, adjust, step outside their comfort zone, flex, as you said. But psychologically, they might feel frustrated that they have to do that, right? And so those emotions, those feelings can weigh on you as you're considering flexing, let's say. And the problem, what psychology teaches us, is that when you're feeling strong emotions, you don't have unlimited resources to deal with them. In fact, if you're trying to do a task and you're trying to work in a situation, communicate, and do all these things that a modern workforce requires, and especially the challenges we talked about before, those are all going to consume your resources. And then on top of that, if you're feeling some of these feelings of discomfort, what I find people often do is they often, unfortunately, flee the situation because they're motivated to protect themselves and kind of relieve themselves of these feelings of discomfort. And so that's where the psychological piece comes in terms of learning to flex your behavior. I think that back to comment back on what Dave was talking about. What was interesting as you were talking, I was thinking to myself that a lot of what we were talking about in terms of the hybrid work and DEI, and especially DEI related topics in groups, and also hybrid and flexible work arrangements. I think what leaders face is the challenge, not just of flexing, but also of finding out, developing creative solutions. I think that's really the challenge, because it's not just a one-on-one situation. A lot of my original work was one-on-one. I'm from this culture, or I have a personality that is inconsistent with how I need to act and how do I flex my behavior. Okay, that happens. That's very common. However, in the situations we're talking about, it's a little bit more complicated. And so how does a leader or a manager come up with sort of very creative solutions to not only understand what the different needs are in the group, which of course requires, as you talk about, cultural intelligence, but also to attend to those needs and to develop creative solutions that can attend to multiple needs without cannibalizing others. And I think that's like the real creative work, I think.
Yeah. I can empathize with that challenge myself. It's certainly one thing to adapt or flex or be in an uncomfortable situation in a one-on-one setting, but I think you're exactly right. And I see that we've got participants chatting the same thing. It's not just a challenge of knowing when to flex, how to flex. It's how can we come up with creative solutions, new solutions that haven't been thought about yet to make sure that we're making the best situation for all, right? We've had some interesting questions come in around the relationship between CQ and EQ. I'm going to save that one for the end. We just got a question asking about some concrete examples, and I want to use one of our participants' questions, and I'm actually going to put it to both of you, Andy and Dave, because I know, Andy, you're currently a professor. Dave, I know that you've been a professor and done a lot of teaching and education in the class. This is a really interesting question. It's an individual from Slovakia who's currently teaching courses at a university, and their classes are being increasingly filled with more and more students from the former Soviet republics, a lot of them coming from Ukraine and Russia. And we can all appreciate that there's a lot of tension right now in those two particular regions of the world. And this individual is wondering if you could speak to, as you're thinking with your educator hat on, how might an educator think about approaching that when there are going to be extremely polarized viewpoints in that classroom of these students coming from very polarized regions? Do either of you want to start to tackle that question? It's a big one. Go ahead, Andy.
Happy to, or Dave, either way. Yeah, so I've experienced that on a more minor scale. We have, I think it was last year, I had a student from Ukraine and also a student from Russia in the same class. And I've had students from countries before that have conflicts with each other, the countries too. so lots of caveats here. I know nothing about Slovakian academic culture or Slovakian culture to begin with, frankly. Very little. So I'm speaking from my perspective, and that's really the best advice I can give from my perspective. And then people can try to see if that works for them and translates for them. I mean, what I've found to be really important in these contexts is two things, I think. To create norms in the classroom in terms of how we act, how we treat each other, what the norms for respectful communication and psychological safety are within our classroom, just like a leader might do on a team, right, on a global team. But that, yes, you have your culture, you have this culture, there's this culture, there's that culture, but here's our culture, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that I really try to do, is to facilitate the creation of relationships. I think that's really important, because when you don't know someone and you just identify them as Russian or identify them as Ukrainian, you don't know anything about them. And you're just reacting to that point of identification that you probably have strong feelings about. But as you start to get to know them, and if as a classroom teacher, you can sometimes, depending on the setting, I don't know this, as I say, I don't know what Slovakian academic culture is like, but at least here in the US, I could create conditions for people to really create connections, have opportunities to get to know each other, have opportunities to discover similarities that they have. Now, they have one obvious similarity, which is that they're in the same class, right? In the same situation, right? But what other similarities do they have? And if you can start to create even the beginnings of a relationship, then those quote unquote difficult conversations are not between two people who don't know each other and all they do is identify with the background, the cultural background, but they're difficult conversations with people who have started the initial steps towards creating a bond. And I think that increases the chances of success.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I'd like to ask Dave to speak to that as well. But just as a recap, some of these practical takeaways we want to make sure that we're remembering, that we're hearing from Dave and Andy. Dave talked about creating a third culture. That's sort of what Andy's talking about here. How can we create shared norms inside of the classroom that might be a different set of norms than either this side or that side have? We have our own third set of norms now. We've also talked about expectation setting before a meeting. Instead of just going into the meeting and assuming it's going to happen well, we can take steps ourselves to set expectations and align ahead of time, very practically speaking. And I really love this piece about facilitating relationships that go beyond the initial identity that we might assume about someone or think about someone when we first interact with them. Dave, why don't you go ahead and respond as well?
The first thing that came to my mind was somewhat similar to what Andy talked about there, in terms of they do have something in common, and part of it's obvious, they're both in a classroom, but leveraging some of these other commonalities, and they might even be other aspects of their identities. I saw Brenda in the chat earlier referenced individuals who are neurodivergent, and you'd want to be careful about how you do this, but it might be finding a bond with somebody else who's on the spectrum, who's also trying to pursue their education together, or somebody a Ukrainian and Russian who both happen to be trans or not be heteronormative or whatever it might be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be those kinds of issues. It could be somebody who single parent home or grew up in a different way. So I like where Andy went with that there's a personal relationship piece that's bonded, because what a lot of the social science would tell us is we can form in groups really, really fast. That's both positive and negative. So leveraging the power of building some bias on that. My other thought, a little bit more concretely connected to the kinds of things that you were just summarizing, Keela, in the work that we did that led up to the Digital Diverse and Divided book that came out this past year, really was talking about these issues of when you have people who are polarized around, very important issues that are built into them for a long time from the worlds from which they come, et cetera. And, if you go all the way back to Sharif's experiment where he took the 12-year-old boys and brought them to camp and just named them as being two different teams, it took them coming to some shared problems that they wanted to solve together to actually work on it. So in some ways, the classroom is an ideal experience to do that, of you both have an assignment that you have to have done, or you have some kind of shared problem. So you're going to have to figure out how to work on this. And at some point, I would actually suggest it's useful then to zoom back in on their differences and say, so what can we learn about the fact that we have very different perspectives on, well, let's go right at it, the war or whatever else it might be, and how do we actually use that to even fuel some innovative thinking in terms of what we do with it. I, like Andy, don't have enough sophistication or enough experience in that region to say this with a whole lot of credibility. But one interesting opportunity you have is neither one of them are in their home country. So they're both in a third place. And may actually feel some frustration about their points of origin. And I've seen that with Indians and Pakistanis together in a place like Dubai, where suddenly well, actually, we have far more in common here than we have different. So let's figure out ways to overcome what our political leaders have told us we have to be at strife about. So anyway, just some thoughts on that in terms of, I love the thought that it starts with, in the context of relationship, helping them bond, and then getting to some very tangible thing that they're going to care about. Your grade is dependent upon whether or not you can actually work together and solve this challenge.
Can I just add one? Thank you, Dave. I just add one more example I just thought of.
Yeah,
that,
of course, please.
This happened a little while back. We have a lot of Chinese students in our courses, in our business courses, and as part of an assignment in a course, I was having students come and get into groups and choose a country around the world where they would look at my field is organizational behavior, organizational psychology, and to look at differences in organizational behavior between that country and the United States, because the United States is the country we all have in common because we're all here in my university here. So one group chose Taiwan, and I got an email the next day from a Chinese student saying that, Professor Malinsky, I thought you said that we need to choose countries. Taiwan is not a country. And it was a very interesting question that I actually had to, I had to figure out whether I was going to address that as people have different perspectives on whether Taiwan's a country, or whether I take a stand and say that, I believe X, and then that's the operating norm. So, you can get it in terms of even subtle examples like that. I thought that it just came to mind. I remembered.
Yeah, it looks like one of our participants has a very similar experience in their own classroom, almost exactly verbatim what you just described,
Yeah.
Andy. I want to move us on to another question, but first I want to comment. I think something Dave said there was very powerful. It is really important to use this idea of creating a third culture or finding out what do we have in common. We're both in the same class. We both like X. But I think what's so powerful to me about the cultural intelligence framework is it can give you some confidence to do what Dave was just challenging us to do. It's great to start with what's our commonality, but we also need to be curious enough, confident enough to get uncomfortable, like Andy suggests, on talking about also what our differences are. And using a framework like cultural intelligence can help us do that in a way that's effective, right? Do that in a way that is allowing us to stay true to ourselves while also feeling confident going into a situation and saying, Dave, that's an interesting perspective. I disagree. And here's why. So let's keep going because I want to make sure we get one more question in before we do some Q&A with the audience. we've talked a lot today about cultural intelligence, about some of the challenges that many of us are hearing about and experiencing. And we've talked about a lot of different strategies, right? Creating that third culture, creating those norms, finding commonalities, setting expectations ahead of a meeting, et cetera, et cetera. Let's talk a little bit about what benefits can individuals or even organizations gain by leveraging some of these strategies that we've talked about today? What are the outcomes that you might expect in a classroom where you're intentionally trying to build those connections, as Andy talks about? What happens when a leader is intentional about trying to make sure that beyond a one-on-one conversation, they're making decisions and being open about what's going to work best for the group as a whole? So let's talk about what organizations and institutions can reap in terms of benefits if they take these approaches. Dave, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, you and I, Keela, could list off the outcomes we know from the research on cultural intelligence predicts one's adjustment and adaptability to different cultures, trust and innovation, judgment and decision-making, et cetera. And I don't mean to undermine those at all with what I'm about to say. Those are very real outcomes based upon robust research. But I think as it relates to today's conversation, the key outcome for the individual leader, which I'll then talk about how it spills out for the organization or their team, is that somehow you have a compass to navigate amid this disruptive, unpredictable world. So while it's not as simple as here's the way to pass the business card, or here's the 3 things to do when you lead a brainstorming session with this group, it's also not completely opaque. Like, I have no idea how I should even go through with this. And one of the things that we'll often do with organizations is help them create some decision-making trees. If I have these cultural values that are reflected in the group, then how do I adjust and adapt related to that? At an organizational level, I mean, I would say everyone should be a little suspicious of any framework or any solution that's offered with people telling you dogmatically, here's what it's proven to do, and you'll make 10 times as much money. And the research there's so many other things going on, but it doesn't take rocket science. It does take social science to see that if you're actually more adaptable and adjustable, that it's going to help your mental well-being of you and your team, that you can create more psychologically safe teams. You can be a more inclusive leader. That then leads to innovation, which then leads to higher levels of productivity, employee engagement, and so forth. So, we call them, proximal and distal outcomes. How far out do we want to get? So even if we can't say, build your CQ and you'll automatically see an impact on your bottom line, it isn't too hard to see the ways that, the increased adaptability that it allows for, the increased inclusiveness that it allows for, does then trickle down to the bottom line.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Dave. Andy, we'd appreciate your perspective on this as well. What kind of outcomes can individuals or organizations expect if they start to, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, learning how to flex, maybe learning a little bit about CQ? Go ahead and respond as well.
Well, I'm not a CQ expert. I'll leave that to you guys. But if people start to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, I think they can start to discover things that they never thought discover activities or tasks that they never thought that they maybe feared and avoided, but that they actually find aren't as hard or are actually more interesting than they thought they would be. I think people I think people are often scared to do things outside their cultural or personal comfort zones. And as a result, they narrow their worlds subtly. And I think that once people have the capacity and courage, and I talk about this in my work, to be able to do this, and it's not a snap your fingers and it happens type of thing. It takes work, right? But once people are able to do it, I think learning can happen. You're not going to learn anything. Certainly not going to learn anything about yourself from avoiding. And I think you can really learn and grow. And so learning and growth happens at the individual level. and people can start to maybe even feel proud of themselves. And I think that that's really powerful. So that's and then as Dave said, there in social sciences we talk about proximal and distal, so things that are sort of closer and things that are farther away. Of course, things will very likely trickle down once that happens to have other types of positive outcomes. But I think that from the level of an individual person and their growth and their life, I think that those are the outcomes that I look at.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. I'm going to move us into our Q&A section, but hopefully the discussion today with the panelists just around this idea of getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, learning how to flex, learning a little bit more about this framework or concept we call cultural intelligence. Hopefully you've been able to start making some of the connections to how these types of things, how learning how to flex our behavior, how learning as a leader to start building third cultures and getting uncomfortable and being okay with that. How can those really prepare us for the future world? Because it's going to continue to evolve. And we have to be able to adapt, and we have to be okay with discomfort of machine learning, AI, hybrid work, whatever it may be. So let's go ahead and get into some of the questions that have come through from the audience. I want to start by asking a question from Andy here. We have from Harry Coolin. He says, in global dexterity, you put a heavy emphasis on rehearsal and preparation for an upcoming cross-cultural meeting or event, often in a business context. How would you suggest applying the approach to an impromptu cross-cultural encounter? So can you go ahead and respond to that?
Well, I think life is always improvised. I think that preparation and rehearsal is if you think that that's gonna, like, if you think that what you're preparing for and rehearsing for is identical to what you'll experience, I think that's a fallacy. I don't think that happens, but I do think that preparing and rehearsing in multiple variations of something provides you with sort of like it starts to sort of like populate your own AI mind with all different possibilities, so that you can then use instinct. Like, your instinct is a result of preparation in multiple circumstances with multiple situations that might happen. It's no surprise that athletes, I'm a sports fan, athletes, baseball players, they don't usually just go from high school to the major leagues. They go into single A, double A, triple A. These are the different sort of preparation leagues, and they're put into all different circumstances and situations, so that ultimately when they're in the major leagues, in the real situation that counts the most, they've seen and experienced a whole range of things in terms of rehearsal, so that their capacity to be able to improvise is enhanced. I think that's the connection between the two. So I think, I guess what I would say is that preparation and rehearsal increases the chances that you'll be more successful at improvising. Same with a jazz musician, by the way, too, where improvising is the essential aspect of doing jazz, right? The more gigs you do, the more rehearsal and practice you do, then in the moment when you hear a note, you're going to say, I can riff on that note, but you're not going to say it. You're going to feel it, and then you're going to do it. But that comes from previous experience.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And I already see a lot of participants are agreeing with this usefulness of learning how to improvise. Several people are talking about how they've taken an improv class and it's actually helped them hone in on this ability to sort of flex in the moment. But anybody who thinks that they're going to be able to do that without practice, without preparation, without lots of reflection, you're right. It's not going to be quite there. We have to be intentional about practicing it. Dave, I'm sure you could add to that question. Go ahead and add your 2 cents before I move us to another question.
Yeah, just real quick, I'm just going to riff now off of Andy's thing to keep the theme going, but I'm thinking about what that's looked like for me as someone who's done a lot of facilitating throughout the years. When I was first in a university classroom in the US and I would ask any questions and nobody asked them, I'm like, wow, I am such a great communicator, till I gave the exam and I'm like, oh crap, like apparently this was not. So then, my first step in that was like trying to do things like, okay, we've just looked at some really complex information. I know you have questions. Let me hear them. Okay, that was the first. And so then I go to Singapore and I'm teaching and I try that, and it's still crickets. That like thing that I had rehearsed and known didn't work for me. So then it's like, oh, wait, you need to write down a question or come up with question in groups. And then I'm going to ask each group to share it back. Whereas today, like I still want to spend some time thinking about the group that I'm going to be in front of. But to Andy's point, I don't have to work quite as hard. And sometimes, I'll step into an environment where I think nobody's going to voice their questions and they're asking them before. So it's that improvising of like, okay, I'm not dealing with a very typical crowd here, so I shouldn't just keep going with no, I know none of you are going to feel comfortable asking questions. So anyway, it was just a specific example of what he was saying that I've kind of learned through my own non-examples.
Yeah, we've had a few questions about the relationship between cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence, and I want us to respond to that, but I want us to be mindful. I'd like to get one more question in too. And so let's tackle this question and we'll wrap up with cultural intelligence and EQ. So how would you advise the two of you, someone who asked the question of how can you push back on inclusion if how can you push back on inclusion of everyone, right? We're trying to move the needle on inclusion, but how can we do that when the people who we're trying to help be more inclusive are not engaged or interested in what we're trying to do? They're resisting it, as an example. They're not open to the idea of programming around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a tough one. We hear this a lot. I think it goes back to what Andy was saying early on about how open are you? Are you open to new things? And there are going to be people who are and people who aren't. But maybe, Dave, you could start with this one, especially given your most recent book that you've authored. How do you deal with people who are immediately closed off to this whole idea in the first place?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if I understand who we're presuming the resistance is from. So if it's from people who look like me, there's one approach I would take. If it's somebody who's jaded toward, here we go again, we're going to do all the window dressing of saying that we're doing DEI. But if I'm somebody who's part of a marginalized group, I don't really believe it, then I would have a very different approach.
Sure.
So if it's for people like me, I would say it's helping them understand the voice that they have in the conversation. And I would say, I was just with a group last week talking about this with a group of leaders where the organization has said inclusion is a part of your job as a people manager. So it really helped there to say, this is a non-negotiable. It's not something that you get to opt in or opt out of, just like you can't opt out of doing performance reviews of your people. If you're going to be employed at this company and you're going to be a leader, you have to be committed to the priorities of inclusion. If it's somebody that is on the fence wanting to see like, okay, I've been through a lot of these programs before, then I would suggest we do need to demonstrate a lot of grace and patience and show that this is something that we're serious about. There's behavioral commitment. Outside the organizational setting, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is that I think it should actually be opt-in if you're somebody who's regularly on the receiving end of bias and discrimination. Easy for me to say, oh, we should all lean in and be part of it. But if you're just fatigued all the time by one more time you got another microaggression, then hey, you have my support to say like, let me try and be a voice that advocates, amplifying your voices and needs. So I don't know if that entirely gets at it, but that was kind of what hit me when I heard the question.
No, I think that's a good response. And the question wasn't clear on which perspective are we to take or think about in the situation. So I think your answer on both sides of the equation were absolutely relevant. Andy, did you want to add to that at all?
Sure. I mean, if someone's not interested, my sort of along the lines of what Dave said, my instinct is always to try to understand why. and to dig a level deeper. Now, in some situations, you can't because you can't learn anything from them. But if you can, it would be interesting to know: is it fear? Are they afraid because they're I don't know, maybe they feel very uncomfortable having conversations like that are sort of related to DEI topics, and it's just so fearful for them to be able to do it that they'll maybe present it as something that they don't think is important, but it's really fear that's underneath it. Or maybe it's that, I don't know, that they've tried really hard but have been discouraged in the past. And so then that has to do with sort of the capabilities or maybe the buy-in from their colleagues. Who knows? I mean, it could be there could be a lot of reasons. So, I mean, my instinct always is to try to dig one level deeper, and then ultimately to try to figure out where a point of leverage might be. Where, is there anything about this that could actually engage them, and to build on some degree of natural enthusiasm or motivation or drive, as you say, because I think that manufacturing it is not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we can all agree on that. And I think the theme that we've been hearing throughout this discussion, I'm going to take us back to the title. It's the human element. We have to get to the heart of what's happening. The why, as Andy suggests, why is there resistance in the first place? And maybe if we can understand that, we can start to move forward on things, no matter what the perspective is, right? The why could be different on both sides, but it gives us a way to start making connections and moving forward from that spot. We only have a few minutes left, so let's answer the question that's been coming up from a few of our participants on what is the relationship. A lot of people have heard about emotional intelligence. We're talking about a concept that's sort of new today, cultural intelligence. How do those two things play together? Dave, why don't you go ahead and start? We know Andy has mentioned that he might not be the CQ expert, but we want to hear from him too on one more topic if we can. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, real quick. So the similarity is the intelligence research is always about, if it's true to the intelligence research, it's how well can you adapt to different situations? How well can you adapt to your environment? So can you adapt your cognitive skills, IQ, EQ? Can you adapt emotionally to someone else's emotional state and yours? CQ, can you adapt to different cultures? So it's absolutely right to ask, is there a relationship? It's a correlation, and we have looked at it. The answer is not to say, get rid of emotional intelligence, just worry about cultural intelligence. You have to start with emotional intelligence. I have to have an understanding of myself and my own emotional state and be able to pick up on the cues of other people's emotions in familiar context. I often say in lay terms, cultural intelligence picks up where emotional intelligence leaves off and allows us to have that same kind of social sensibility when the cues may mean something entirely different. And I may assume that silence means someone is upset or doesn't understand, when in point of fact, it might actually be a form of respect or something different than that. So that's a 2-cent answer to $1 million question, but lots of research on it, thankfully.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources out there you can also find on sort of how those two things fit together. With our remaining time, Andy, if there was one thing that you could share with the audience, just in terms of, we know there are a lot of challenges out there. There's some we talked about today. There are many challenges we haven't talked about. What kind of advice would you give to people who are really looking to have authentic relationships and make sure that they're learning best practices to be the best versions of themselves, to be the best leaders they can be, to be the best educators that they can be? What would your advice be?
Well, that's a tough question, of course, but I'll give a piece of advice, which would be, I think that it's worth considering trying to find a situation that you might be interested in. And now it could be a conversation with someone that you've never had a conversation with. It could be a task that you've been afraid to do. It could be a role that you've always sort of, been interested in, but sort of felt that maybe you were unqualified for, or that you were afraid of. And just even consider what it would be like to step outside your comfort zone and to try it, and to sort of avoid avoidance. Imagine that you had a magic wand and that you could erase the discomfort and anxiety just for a moment, and think to yourself, would this be something that you'd be interested in doing? I think that's a really good experiment for people to do to try to broaden themselves, professionally or personally.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. Avoid the avoidance. I really like that phrase. And Dave, what piece of advice would you give as a parting note to our participants?
Yeah, I would come back to one of the things we talked about at the beginning, the power of openness and curiosity. Being open doesn't mean you have to change what you believe or what you value, but at least stops to consider a different perspective. And not only does that, improve relationships, but just gives you a wealth of new insights and information, boosts your creativity, etc.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you on behalf of myself and all the participants who we had with us today. Thank you both for your insights and your knowledge and the backgrounds that both of you bring to this conversation. It's been really enjoyable to hear from you and to allow our participants to interact and ask some of the questions that they have. To our participants, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate your time and we hope that you found the discussion valuable. For anybody who was unable to participate, we will share a recording of this session for anybody who signed up so that if you want to watch again or if you want to share it with someone else, you will be able to. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.